At the height of his power, after crushing France and dominating Europe, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would redefine the war. His generals warned him. Some hesitated. Others believed it was madness. But Hitler was convinced. The Soviet Union would collapse in months. One hard strike, one decisive campaign. Instead, he opened the door to a war Germany could not survive. And years later, as Berlin burned and Soviet artillery echoed through the streets, even Hitler admitted, this was the mistake. The evening sun cast long shadows across Adolf Hitler's private study. As he stood before the massive wall map of Europe, his hands clasped behind his back, his pale eyes tracing the arrows that would, within hours, launch the largest military invasion in human history. The map told a story of unbroken triumph. Poland crushed in 27 days, Denmark and Norway secured. France, mighty France with her legendary army and impregnable Maginot Line, defeated in 6 weeks. The colored pins marking German-controlled territory stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. 2 years. In just 2 years, the Wehrmacht had rewritten the map of Europe and shattered the military reputations of nations that had dominated the continent for centuries. And tomorrow, Operation Barbarossa would begin. The culmination of Hitler's ideological obsession, the crusade against Bolshevism that he had promised in the pages of Mein Kampf nearly 2 decades earlier. Mein Führer, the final deployment reports. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel entered quietly, carrying documents that confirmed what Hitler already knew. 3.8 million German troops, 3,350 tanks, 7,200 artillery pieces, 2,770 aircraft, the most powerful military force ever assembled, stood poised along a 1,800-mile front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. At dawn, they would cross into Soviet territory. And within weeks, perhaps months at most, the Bolshevik state would collapse, like all of Germany's previous enemies. Hitler took the documents without looking at them. His mind was not on logistics or force deployments, but on destiny, on the historical mission he believed Providence had assigned him. The conquest of the Soviet Union was not merely military strategy. It was ideological necessity, the fulfillment of his life's purpose. Everything that had come before, the political struggles, the rearmament, the victories in Poland and France, had been preparation for this moment. The German soldier, Hitler said softly, still studying the map, is about to enter the greatest battle in world history. And he will win because he must win. Because racial superiority and ideological conviction will overcome Slavic numbers and communist barbarism. The Soviet Union is a house of cards. We need only kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will collapse. Keitel nodded, though something in his expression suggested less certainty than his Führer's words conveyed. But certainty, absolute, unshakable conviction that will could overcome circumstance, had become Hitler's defining characteristic by June 1941. And that certainty was not baseless fantasy. It was grounded in 2 years of victories so spectacular, so contrary to conventional military wisdom, that they seemed to validate Hitler's belief that he possessed strategic genius, surpassing that of his professionally trained generals. The question that would haunt Germany for the remainder of the war was already forming, though few dared speak it aloud. Had early success created not confidence, but delusion? Had rapid victories produced not strategic clarity, but strategic blindness? Was Hitler about to commit Germany to the one war that even German military excellence could not win? The victories that built invincibility. To understand Hitler's mindset in June 1941 requires understanding the intoxicating string of victories that preceded Barbarossa. Each conquest had reinforced his conviction that conventional military wisdom was obsolete, that his intuition surpassed professional military expertise, that will and ideological conviction could overcome material limitations. Poland had fallen in September 1939 with a speed that shocked even the Wehrmacht's own commanders. The Blitzkrieg tactics, concentrated armor supported by tactical air power, breakthrough and encirclement rather than frontal assault, had shattered Polish defenses before they could coalesce into coherent resistance. Warsaw surrendered on September 27th, barely 3 weeks after the invasion began. Hitler had promised swift victory. The Wehrmacht had delivered it so completely that international observers struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. But Poland, despite its rapid defeat, had been expected to fall. The real test came in May 1940, when Hitler ordered the invasion of France, despite nearly all his senior generals advising delay or reconsideration. France possessed what was arguably the world's finest army in 1940, experienced, well-equipped, supported by British forces, protected by defensive fortifications that military experts considered impregnable. The French had defeated Germany in World War I. They had superior numbers of tanks. They had time to prepare. Every conventional calculation suggested the campaign would be long, costly, potentially unsuccessful. Hitler ordered the attack anyway, overruling his general's caution. And the result was the most spectacular military victory in modern European history. The German assault through the Ardennes forest, terrain French military doctrine said was impassable for massed armor, achieved complete strategic surprise. Guderian's panzer divisions broke through French defenses at Sedan and raced to the English Channel, cutting off the best British and French units in Belgium. Within 6 weeks, France had surrendered. Paris fell virtually undefended. The French army, which had held the Western Front for 4 years in World War I, collapsed in 42 days. Hitler accepted the French surrender in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918, a deliberate humiliation that symbolized the complete reversal of World War I's outcome. He danced a little jig of triumph, captured on newsreel footage that would be shown in German cinemas. The footage was not propaganda exaggeration. Hitler genuinely believed he had achieved something that validated his entire worldview. The British Expeditionary Force, cut off at Dunkirk, had evacuated across the Channel in one of history's great retreats. But it was still a retreat, still a defeat. Britain stood alone, vulnerable to invasion, her army's equipment abandoned on French beaches. The Luftwaffe launched the Battle of Britain to achieve air superiority for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of England. Though the Luftwaffe ultimately failed to destroy the RAF, Britain was clearly on the defensive, clearly incapable of threatening German dominance of continental Europe. By summer 1940, Hitler controlled virtually all of Western and Central Europe. Only Britain remained undefeated, and Britain was an island under siege, incapable of projecting military power onto the continent. Germany's military reputation had been transformed from the defeated nation of 1918 to the unstoppable conqueror of 1940. And at the center of this transformation stood Adolf Hitler, the former corporal who had overruled professional military advice and been proven spectacularly right. The ideological imperative. But Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was not merely or even primarily driven by military calculation. It was driven by ideological obsession that had consumed him since his earliest political writings. The destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism, the conquest of Lebensraum, living space, in the East, the enslavement or elimination of the Slavic peoples. These were not secondary war aims, but core elements of Nazi ideology that Hitler had never abandoned, despite tactical compromises. In Mein Kampf, written during his imprisonment after the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, Hitler had outlined his vision with disturbing clarity. Germany's future lay in the conquest of territory in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Soviet Union. He portrayed this as historical necessity. The German people required agricultural land and resources that the racially inferior Slavs did not deserve and could not properly utilize. The Bolshevik state, in Hitler's ideology, represented the ultimate enemy, a system controlled by Jews that threatened to spread communism across Europe. This ideological conviction had shaped Nazi foreign policy from the beginning, but tactical circumstances had required postponement. Germany needed to rearm, needed to secure its western flank, needed to avoid the two-front war that had destroyed Imperial Germany in World War I. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, which partitioned Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union, was never intended as permanent alliance, but as temporary expedient, a way to avoid fighting on two fronts simultaneously while dealing with France and Britain. By June 1941, with Western Europe conquered and Britain neutralized, Hitler believed the moment had arrived. The ideological crusade against Bolshevism could finally begin. And military calculation, filtered through ideological conviction, suggested the campaign would be brief and decisive. The Soviet Union, Hitler reasoned, was fundamentally weak. Its army had been gutted by Stalin's purges of 1937 to 38, which had executed or imprisoned most experienced officers. Its performance in the Winter War against Finland in 1939 to 40 had been catastrophically incompetent. A tiny nation had humiliated the Red Army, inflicting casualties at ratios that suggested the Soviet military was tactically obsolete. Soviet equipment was inferior, Soviet doctrine was primitive, Soviet leadership was compromised by communist ideology that prioritized political reliability over military competence. Most significantly in Hitler's mind, the Soviet state lacked cohesion. It was a forced union of unwilling peoples held together by terror. The subject nationalities, Ukrainians, Baltics, Caucasians, would welcome German forces as liberators from communist oppression. The whole structure would collapse once subjected to the shock of Blitzkrieg warfare, just as Poland and France had collapsed. "We have only to kick in the door," Hitler told his generals repeatedly, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." The warnings ignored. Not all of Hitler's military advisors shared his optimistic assessment. Several senior Wehrmacht officers had attempted to express concerns about the planned invasion, though they did so carefully given Hitler's intolerance for dissenting opinions after his vindication in France. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, selected to command Army Group South in the invasion, had quietly expressed concern about the vast distances involved. The Soviet Union was not France. It was a continental empire, spanning 11 time zones, with primitive road networks and climatic extremes that German forces had never encountered. The further German armies advanced, the longer and more vulnerable their supply lines would become. General Georg Thomas, head of the War Economy and Armaments Office, had submitted reports warning that Germany lacked the economic capacity for a prolonged war against the Soviet Union. German fuel reserves were adequate for perhaps 6 months of operations. Soviet industrial capacity, particularly factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, could not be reached by German forces. A quick victory was essential because Germany could not win a war of attrition against Soviet resources. Most significantly, Generaloberst Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, had attempted to present Hitler with realistic assessments of Soviet military strength. German intelligence suggested the Red Army possessed approximately 170 divisions. Halder's staff had identified potential Soviet reserves that could expand that number significantly. The Soviet Union had vast manpower reserves, populations that Germany could not match. If the Red Army did not collapse quickly, Germany would face exactly the attritional warfare that had destroyed Imperial Germany in World War I. Hitler dismissed these concerns with a mixture of ideological conviction and his recent track record of being right when his generals were wrong. Had they not advised against the Poland campaign? Had they not expressed deep reservations about attacking France? Had he not been proven spectacularly correct on both occasions? The professional military establishment, Hitler had concluded, was overly cautious, too bound by conventional thinking, unable to grasp that ideological conviction and tactical surprise could overcome material disadvantages. "I have heard the doubters before," Hitler told a gathering of senior officers in March 1941. They doubted Poland would fall quickly. They doubted France could be defeated in weeks. They doubt now. But Germany does not advance through doubt. It advances through will, through conviction, through the superiority of the National Socialist spirit over the decadence of our enemies. The atmosphere in Wehrmacht High Command had become one where expressing reservations was interpreted as lack of conviction, where professional military judgment was subordinated to ideological certainty, where Hitler's intuition was treated as more reliable than staff assessments based on intelligence and logistics. This dynamic, successful leaders becoming increasingly convinced of their own infallibility, surrounding themselves with yes-men, dismissing warnings that contradict their assumptions, is one of history's recurring patterns. And in June 1941, it was about to produce catastrophic consequences. The atmosphere of Destiny Berlin in early 1941 was a city intoxicated by victory. Nazi propaganda, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels with masterful skill, had transformed Germany's military conquests into proof of racial and ideological superiority. Newsreels showed German troops marching through conquered capitals. Massive rallies celebrated victories that seemed to validate everything Nazi ideology had promised. Hitler's popularity was at its absolute peak. He was not merely Germany's political leader, but the genius who had reversed the humiliation of Versailles and made Germany master of Europe. This atmosphere of triumph made skepticism about the Soviet campaign psychologically difficult, even for those who privately harbored doubts. To question Operation Barbarossa was to question the entire narrative of German invincibility, to suggest that perhaps the victories in Poland and France had been circumstantial, rather than proof of inherent superiority. Few Germans in positions of authority were prepared to embrace such uncomfortable conclusions. Moreover, Hitler himself radiated absolute confidence. In meetings with military commanders, he spoke of the coming campaign, not with the careful qualifications of professional military planning, but with the certainty of ideological conviction. This was not merely another military operation, but the fulfillment of historical destiny. The moment when German racial superiority would definitively triumph over Slavic barbarism and Jewish Bolshevism. When Barbarossa begins, Hitler declared in May 1941, the world will hold its breath and make no comment. This will be the greatest military operation in history, and its success will establish the 1,000-year Reich that will dominate Europe for generations to come. The generals who heard these proclamations responded with professional efficiency, organizing armies, coordinating logistics, preparing operational plans. But the ideological certainty that infused Hitler's thinking had begun to infect military planning in dangerous ways. The campaign timeline assumed Soviet collapse within 8 to 12 weeks. Logistics were planned for a brief, decisive campaign rather than sustained operations. Winter clothing was not procured in sufficient quantities because the war would be over before winter. These were not minor oversights, but fundamental assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. June 22, 1941, the door kicked open. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, German artillery opened fire along the entire Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, had begun. Over 3.8 million German and Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. The initial assault achieved complete surprise. Soviet forces, despite intelligence warnings Stalin had dismissed, were caught unprepared. In the first hours and days, everything seemed to confirm Hitler's optimistic predictions. German armor raced forward, achieving penetrations that made the France campaign look slow by comparison. Soviet units were encircled by the hundreds of thousands. Luftwaffe strikes destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft in the first day, most of them on the ground. The Red Army appeared to be disintegrating exactly as Hitler had predicted. In Berlin, initial reports generated euphoria. Hitler paced his headquarters, studying maps that showed German spearheads driving deep into Soviet territory. "I told them," he said to Keitel. "I told them the structure was rotten. We are witnessing not military campaign but historical vindication." What Hitler did not yet understand, what would become horrifyingly clear in the coming months, was that he had just committed Germany to the one war it could not win. The Soviet Union would not collapse. The Red Army would not disintegrate. The distances were too vast, the resources too deep, the Russian capacity for sacrifice too great. Germany had kicked in the door, but behind that door lay not a hollow structure, but a vast, resilient, industrialized nation that would absorb punishment beyond imagination and continue fighting. The strategy Hitler would come to regret most had begun. The illusion of invincibility was about to collide with the reality of Soviet determination and industrial capacity, and Germany would pay for that collision with millions of lives and ultimate defeat. But on June 22, 1941, as German tanks rolled east and victory seemed certain, only a handful of pessimistic German officers understood the terrible truth. They had just launched the war that would destroy the Third Reich. The door had been kicked open. What came through it would be nightmare beyond Hitler's ideology to comprehend. Thank you for watching my stories. I truly put a lot of time and effort into every script to show what really happened and what real people experienced during those years. If you enjoy deep, honest historical storytelling, please consider supporting the channel with a like and a comment. And I would truly appreciate your subscription. New stories are published here every day about the decisions that changed the world and the people who lived through them. Now, let's continue. General Feldmarschall Fedor von Bock stood over the operations map, studying the colored pins that marked Wehrmacht positions, now hundreds of kilometers inside Soviet territory. By every conventional military metric, Operation Barbarossa was succeeding beyond even optimistic projections. In just 8 weeks, German forces had encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies, captured over 2 million prisoners, advanced further faster than any military operation in history. The Minsk pocket alone had netted 300,000 Soviet prisoners. Smolensk had fallen. The road to Moscow lay open. Yet something was wrong. Von Bock felt it in ways that transcended the triumphant statistics his staff recited. Soviet units encircled and destroyed were somehow replaced by fresh divisions that German intelligence had not known existed. Territory captured at catastrophic cost to Soviet defenders was nevertheless defended. New Soviet forces appeared, fought with desperate intensity, retreated, and appeared again days later as if losses meant nothing. "How many Soviet divisions have we destroyed?" Von Bock asked his intelligence chief. "Approximately 150, Herr Feldmarschall." "And how many Soviet divisions do we currently face?" The intelligence officer hesitated before answering. "Approximately 240, Herr Feldmarschall." Von Bock stared at the map in silence. The mathematics were impossible. Germany had destroyed more Soviet divisions than German intelligence had estimated existed at the war's start, yet faced more Soviet forces now than in June. Either Soviet force estimates had been catastrophically wrong, or the Red Army possessed replacement capacity that violated everything German planning had assumed. "They were supposed to collapse," von Bock said quietly. "The Führer said we need only kick in the door and the whole rotten structure would fall." "We have kicked in the door. We have driven 700 kilometers into their territory. We have destroyed armies. Why are they still fighting?" No one answered, because the answer was becoming terrifyingly clear. The Soviet Union was not collapsing. The war would not end quickly, and Germany had committed itself to a campaign for which it lacked the resources to sustain. The victories that weren't decisive. The opening phase of Operation Barbarossa produced German victories at scales that should have been strategically decisive. The Białystok-Minsk encirclement trapped 290,000 Soviet troops. The Smolensk encirclement captured another 300,000. At Uman, 100,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded and destroyed. At Kiev in September, the largest encirclement in military history netted 665,000 Soviet prisoners. These were catastrophic defeats by any historical standard. France, with far better equipped and trained forces, had collapsed after losing a fraction of these numbers. Poland had surrendered after less severe defeats. By September 1941, the Red Army had suffered casualties exceeding 2.5 million killed, wounded, or captured. losses that would have ended any previous war in history. Yet the Red Army continued fighting. More troublingly, for German commanders observing the pattern, Soviet resistance was not weakening, but intensifying. Units fought with desperate determination even when encircled, delaying German advances and inflicting casualties that Blitzkrieg doctrine was supposed to minimize. Soviet counterattacks, though tactically unsophisticated and often suicidally costly, were constant, forcing German units to maintain defensive vigilance even while conducting offensive operations. Guderian, commanding 2nd Panzer Army, reported encountering Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks that were superior to German armor, better armed, better armored, capable of shrugging off German anti-tank fire that had destroyed French and British tanks easily. "Our tanks are inferior," Guderian wrote bluntly in reports that shocked Wehrmacht High Command. "The T-34 is the finest tank in the world. We have nothing that can reliably penetrate its frontal armor." More disturbingly, Soviet industrial capacity seemed unlimited. Factories in the Western Soviet Union, threatened by German advance, were being dismantled and relocated beyond the Ural Mountains. Entire industrial plants transported by rail to regions German forces could never reach. By autumn 1941, over 1,500 major industrial enterprises had been evacuated eastward, taking with them the machinery, workers, and productive capacity that German planners had assumed would be captured. This was something German strategic planning had never seriously considered, that the Soviet Union's vast geography allowed industrial infrastructure to be moved beyond German operational reach, that production capacity destroyed in the West could be reconstituted in the East, that the war's industrial equation could not be resolved through territorial conquest alone. The problem of distance. What German planning had fundamentally miscalculated was not Soviet military capability, which was indeed inferior initially, but geography. The Soviet Union was not France, where mobile warfare could reach strategic objectives within weeks. It was a continental empire where distances consumed German logistical capacity faster than victories could exploit territorial gains. By September 1941, German spearheads had advanced 600 to 700 kilometers into Soviet territory. This was spectacular by historical standards. Napoleon had required months to reach similar depths in 1812. But spectacular advances created problems that tactical excellence could not solve. Every kilometer advanced stretched supply lines that depended on inadequate infrastructure. Soviet railroads operated on different gauge than German railways, requiring time-consuming conversion or transshipment. Roads marked on maps as highways were often dirt tracks that became impassable mud in rain. Fuel consumption exceeded logistical capacity to deliver it. Ammunition expenditure rates, higher than expected due to Soviet defensive determination, strained supply networks designed for brief, decisive campaigns. Food, medical supplies, spare parts, everything required to sustain modern armies had to be transported across distances that made rapid delivery impossible. German trucks, designed for European roads, began breaking down at catastrophic rates on Russian terrain. Horses, the Wehrmacht still depended heavily on horse-drawn transport despite its mechanized reputation, died from exhaustion and lack of fodder. By autumn 1941, some German units were receiving only 30% of required supplies. Frontline soldiers went on reduced rations, Ammunition was rationed. Tank units sat immobilized not because of combat damage, but because fuel deliveries could not reach them. Meanwhile, the calendar advanced toward winter. German planners had assumed the campaign would end before cold weather arrived. Consequently, winter clothing, antifreeze for vehicles, cold weather lubricants, all the specialized equipment necessary for winter warfare, had not been procured in sufficient quantities. Wehrmacht quartermasters began warning in September that if the war continued into winter, German forces would face catastrophic supply crises. But the warnings went largely unheeded because Hitler remained convinced that one more offensive, one final push to capture Moscow, would break Soviet resistance and end the war. The drive that failed. In October 1941, Hitler ordered Operation Typhoon, the final offensive to capture Moscow before winter. German forces, despite exhaustion and supply difficulties, launched what they believed would be the campaign's climactic battle. Initial results seemed promising. The Vyazma-Bryansk encirclement captured another 670,000 Soviet troops. By mid-October, German reconnaissance units were within 30 kilometers of Moscow's suburbs. But the offensive was consuming its own capacity to advance. Autumn rains transformed Russian roads into seas of mud that immobilized German armor. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, arrived weeks earlier than expected, halting German advances more effectively than Soviet resistance. Tanks bogged down, trucks became trapped, supply columns could not move. Frontline units, within sight of Moscow's spires, lacked the fuel, ammunition, and supplies necessary for the final assault. Then, in early November, winter arrived. Not the gradual cooling German commanders expected, but savage cold that plunged temperatures to -30 Celsius within days. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms because winter clothing had not arrived, began dying from exposure. Vehicle engines froze solid, weapons jammed. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in many units. Soviet forces, equipped for winter warfare and receiving fresh divisions from Siberia, troops trained and equipped for extreme cold, launched counterattacks all along the Moscow front. What German intelligence had dismissed as the Red Army's last reserves turned out to be the first wave of Soviet forces that seemed inexhaustible. By early December 1941, the German offensive had stalled completely. Units that had advanced to Moscow's outskirts were fighting desperately to hold positions against Soviet counterattacks. The Blitzkrieg that had conquered Europe in weeks had ground to a frozen halt in the snow outside Moscow. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, whose panzer forces had led the drive toward Moscow, wrote in his diary, "The offensive capacity of our forces has been exhausted. The troops have reached the limits of their endurance. The idea that we can still take Moscow is fantasy. We should withdraw to defensive positions before we are destroyed in place." But Hitler forbade withdrawal. His stand-fast order of December 16, 1941, commanded German forces to hold every position regardless of circumstances. No retreat, no tactical withdrawals, fight in place until relieved or destroyed. It was a decision born from Hitler's conviction that will could overcome circumstances, that retreat would lead to collapse, as it had for Napoleon. The order prevented complete catastrophe. German lines held despite Soviet pressure. But it confirmed what professional military officers had begun to suspect. The campaign's operational phase had ended. Germany was now committed to a war of attrition in the Soviet Union. precisely the type of warfare that German doctrine said was unwinnable against an enemy with superior resources and manpower. The moment of recognition. The winter of 1941–42 marked the psychological transformation of Operation Barbarossa from temporary setback to strategic disaster. German casualties since June exceeded 750,000, over 20% of the invasion force, killed, wounded, or missing. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Over 2,000 tanks destroyed or abandoned, most not from combat, but from mechanical failure and lack of spare parts. The Luftwaffe had lost over 2,000 aircraft. Thousands of trucks were inoperable. But what made these losses strategically critical was that they could not be replaced at rates necessary to resume offensive operations. German industrial capacity, adequate for brief campaigns, was insufficient for sustained attrition. Meanwhile, Soviet production, evacuated beyond the Urals where German forces could not reach it, was accelerating. The correlation of forces was shifting monthly in Soviet favor. In January 1942, as German forces struggled to survive in frozen positions along a 1,500-kilometer front, the terrible realization spread through Wehrmacht officer corps. The war in the Soviet Union would not end quickly. The Blitzkrieg had failed, not because of tactical defeat, but because strategic assumptions had been wrong. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. Soviet armies, despite catastrophic losses, continued fighting with effectiveness that improved month by month. Soviet industrial capacity could not be captured or destroyed through territorial conquest. Germany had committed its military strength to a campaign it lacked resources to win. The quick victory Hitler had promised had transformed into a war of attrition that favored the enemy with greater reserves, greater industrial capacity, and greater tolerance for casualties. Every month, the war shifted the strategic balance further against Germany. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group South, met privately with other senior commanders in February 1942. "We have won all the battles," he said quietly. "We have captured millions of prisoners, destroyed thousands of tanks, advanced hundreds of kilometers, and yet we are losing the war, because we are fighting an enemy that treats catastrophic losses as acceptable costs, that replaces destroyed armies faster than we can destroy them, that cannot be defeated through tactical excellence because they possess strategic advantages we cannot overcome." The strategy Hitler regretted most had revealed itself not through sudden catastrophe, but through grinding recognition. Germany had invaded a country too vast to conquer, with resources too deep to exhaust, fighting with determination that ideology said was impossible. The war that was supposed to end in weeks had become the war without end, and Germany, committed beyond its capacity to sustain, could neither win nor withdraw. The Blitzkrieg that had conquered Europe had died in the snow outside Moscow. What remained was arithmetic, the pitiless mathematics of industrial capacity, replacement rates, and attrition that favored the Soviet Union more decisively. With every month, the war continued. The door had been kicked open. But behind it lay not a hollow structure, but an abyss into which Germany's military strength would drain until nothing remained. The war that would not end had begun, and Hitler's greatest strategic mistake was becoming undeniable to everyone except Hitler himself. General Feldmarschall Friedrich Paulus sat in the frozen cellar that served as his command post, staring at a radio message from Führer headquarters that represented either madness or denial. so complete it had become indistinguishable from madness. His Sixth Army, once the Wehrmacht's finest formation, 290,000 men who had driven across southern Russia in the summer of 1942, was now trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, surrounded by Soviet forces, starving, freezing, dying at rates exceeding 1,000 per day. Paulus had requested permission to break out, while escape was still theoretically possible. Hitler's response was unambiguous. Sixth Army will hold its positions regardless of enemy encirclement. Capitulation is impossible. The Sixth Army will do its historic duty at Stalingrad until the last soldier and the last bullet. Paulus read the message again, searching for some indication that Hitler understood the reality his field commanders faced. There was none. The order was explicit. Fight in place, accept destruction, die, rather than retreat. It was not military strategy but ideological fanaticism elevated to operational directive. And it would destroy an entire German army not through battlefield defeat, but through command paralysis, rooted in Hitler's refusal to acknowledge that his strategic gamble in southern Russia had failed catastrophically. Outside the cellar, Stalingrad burned. What had been an industrial city of 400,000 inhabitants was now a moonscape of rubble and frozen corpses, where Soviet and German soldiers fought room by room, floor by floor, sometimes within the same ruined building. The battle had consumed both armies like a furnace consuming fuel, leaving behind only ash and trauma. And now, in January 1943, that furnace was about to consume the entire German Sixth Army, while Hitler watched from 1,000 kilometers away, issuing orders disconnected from any military reality. Stalingrad was not merely a battle. It was the physical manifestation of Hitler's strategic mistake made real, the moment when ideological obsession, operational overreach, and refusal to acknowledge failure converged into catastrophe that would mark the irreversible turning point of World War II. The obsession with a name. Hitler's decision to focus German offensive operations on Stalingrad in summer 1942 represented strategic thinking distorted by symbolic significance. The original objective of Case Blue, the 1942 summer offensive, had been the Caucasus oil fields. Germany's fuel crisis made capturing Soviet petroleum resources a strategic necessity. Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga River, was initially a secondary objective, important for securing the northern flank of German forces driving toward the oil fields, but not the operation's primary goal. But Stalingrad bore Stalin's name. And for Hitler, whose entire strategic vision was shaped by ideological conflict with Bolshevism personified by Stalin, the symbolic value of capturing the city bearing his enemy's name became psychologically irresistible. What began as a tactical operation to secure a flank position transformed into an obsessive commitment that diverted forces from the primary objective and committed German strength to urban warfare, the one operational environment where German tactical advantages were neutralized. By August 1942, the Sixth Army under Paulus had reached Stalingrad's outskirts. Initial assessments suggested the city could be taken quickly. Soviet defenses appeared weak, the city was vulnerable, capture seemed imminent. But imminent became weeks, then months, as German forces discovered that urban combat consumed attacking forces with terrifying efficiency. Every building became a fortress. Every street became a killing ground. Every basement and sewer could hide Soviet defenders who would emerge, fight, retreat, and emerge again. German tactical doctrine, designed for mobile warfare across open terrain, was useless in the claustrophobic nightmare of ruined city blocks where Soviet soldiers ambushed from ranges measured in meters. The Luftwaffe's air superiority meant nothing when targets were so close that bombs threatened German troops as much as Soviet defenders. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad, understood this perfectly. His defensive strategy, hug the enemy closely, meant keeping Soviet and German forces so intermixed that German artillery and air power could not be employed without hitting their own troops. Fighting occurred at ranges so close that soldiers could hear their enemies breathing. Entire Soviet regiments were destroyed, holding single buildings for days. But every day of resistance cost the Germans irreplaceable time and troops, while Soviet High Command prepared the counteroffensive that would doom 6th Army. By November 1942, German forces controlled approximately 90% of Stalingrad's ruins. The remaining Soviet defenders held a narrow strip along the Volga River, supplied at night by boats that braved German fire. Victory seemed close. Just one more push, one final effort, and the city would fall completely. Hitler refused to consider any outcome except total victory. 6th Army had fought too long, suffered too much, to withdraw now. The city bearing Stalin's name must fall as proof of German superiority. But while German forces ground themselves down in Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet High Command was executing Operation Uranus, the encirclement that would trap 6th Army in the trap Hitler's obsession had created. The trap closes. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched coordinated offensives north and south of Stalingrad, striking at Romanian and Italian armies protecting 6th Army's flanks. These Axis satellite forces, less well-equipped and less motivated than German units, collapsed under Soviet assault within days. By November 23rd, Soviet pincers met at Kalach, 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The entire 6th Army, 290,000 German and Axis troops, was encircled. The encirclement should not have been strategically decisive. German forces had broken out of Soviet encirclements before. Military doctrine and common sense both indicated the same response. 6th Army should immediately attempt breakout toward German lines while the Soviet ring was still forming and relatively weak. Every hour of delay strengthened Soviet positions and weakened German capacity to escape. Paulus requested permission to break out. His staff officers calculated that immediate breakout offered perhaps 60 to 70% probability of success, high casualties. But the army would survive as a fighting force. Delay would make breakout progressively more difficult as Soviet forces tightened the encirclement and winter conditions worsened. Hitler's response was the stand-fast order that had become his standard reaction to any suggestion of tactical withdrawal. 6th Army would hold Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe would supply the pocket by air. Hermann Göring had personally promised Hitler that air supply was feasible. Relief operations would break through the Soviet encirclement from the outside. 6th Army need only hold its positions until relieved. This assessment was fantasy disconnected from operational reality. The Luftwaffe lacked the transport capacity to supply 290,000 men by air. Delivering necessary supplies would require 800 tons daily. But Luftwaffe transport capacity, weather conditions, and Soviet air defense meant actual deliveries averaged 100 tons per day. 6th Army began starving immediately. Relief operations, launched in December, under Manstein's command, advanced to within 50 kilometers of the pocket before Soviet resistance stopped them. Manstein urgently requested that 6th Army break out toward his forces, while the corridor was still relatively narrow. Hitler refused. 6th Army must hold Stalingrad. The relief operation failed. The corridor closed, and 6th Army was left alone, surrounded, dying slowly in the frozen ruins. The death of an army. What followed was not battle but systematic destruction, spread across 10 weeks of unimaginable suffering. 6th Army soldiers, trapped in a pocket roughly 50 by 30 kilometers, endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Starvation became universal. Daily rations dropped to 200 grams of bread, insufficient to sustain life, particularly in temperatures reaching -30 Celsius. Soldiers ate horses, then rats, then boiled leather. Men weakened, collapsed, froze to death in positions they were too exhausted to defend. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded soldiers died from minor injuries that would have been treatable under normal circumstances. Frostbite, gangrene, typhus, dysentery. Disease killed more men than Soviet bullets. Soviet forces, methodically tightening the ring, compressed the pocket progressively smaller. German positions that had held for weeks were abandoned, as units lacked strength to man defensive lines. Ammunition ran low, artillery fell silent for lack of shells. The Luftwaffe's pathetic supply efforts became increasingly sporadic as Soviet air defenses improved. By late December, soldiers in the pocket understood they were not being supplied but slowly forgotten, left to die while Hitler issued proclamations about historic duty and sacrifice. The psychological trauma was profound. These were not inexperienced conscripts, but veteran soldiers who had fought across Russia for 18 months. They had believed in German invincibility, had trusted their leadership, had executed impossible orders because they believed competent command would not abandon them. Now they understood they were being deliberately sacrificed for symbolic purposes disconnected from military necessity. Letters home, which German military censors read and filed, documented the transformation from battlefield determination to despair. "We have been betrayed," wrote one soldier in December. "They promise relief that never comes. They promise supplies that do not arrive. They order us to fight to the last man while our leaders are safely distant. This is not war. This is murder." Soviet propaganda, broadcast into the pocket, offered surrender terms. Initially, few German soldiers considered capitulation. Surrender to the Soviets was portrayed as fate worse than death. But as starvation and cold killed thousands daily, surrender became not ideological failure, but simple survival instinct. Individuals, then small groups, then entire units began crossing Soviet lines, despite orders forbidding capitulation. By late January 1943, the pocket had been split into smaller, isolated groups. Paulus, promoted to field marshal by Hitler in a gesture meant to inspire continued resistance, no German field marshal had ever surrendered, faced the choice between ordering final destruction or accepting the inevitable. On January 31st, he surrendered the southern pocket. The northern pocket surrendered 2 days later. Of the 290,000 men encircled in November, approximately 91,000 entered Soviet captivity. Only 6,000 would eventually return to Germany. The remainder had died, frozen, starved, killed in combat, or perished in Soviet camps. An entire army had been destroyed not through battlefield defeat, but through command decisions that prioritized symbolic significance over military reality. The shock that could not be hidden Stalingrad represented something qualitatively different from previous German defeats. The winter battles of 1941 to 42 had been setbacks, but could be presented as temporary difficulties overcome through German resilience. Stalingrad was catastrophic defeat so complete that Nazi propaganda, despite desperate efforts, could not disguise its magnitude. The German people learned of Sixth Army's destruction through the announcement of 3 days of national mourning in February 1943. Goebbels's propaganda machine attempted to frame the defeat as heroic sacrifice. German soldiers fighting to the last bullet in defense of European civilization against Bolshevik hordes. But Germans reading casualty lists, receiving letters from soldiers describing abandonment and starvation, understood something more disturbing. Their leadership had deliberately destroyed an entire army for reasons disconnected from military necessity. The psychological impact inside Germany was profound. For the first time, significant numbers of Germans began questioning whether the war was winnable. If an entire army could be destroyed through command incompetence and ideological obsession, what did that suggest about Germany's strategic position? If Hitler's leadership had produced Stalingrad, could he be trusted with Germany's future? Within the Wehrmacht, Stalingrad destroyed remaining professional confidence in Hitler's strategic judgment. The operational vindication Hitler had claimed after the Stand Fast Order prevented collapse in winter 1941 to 42 was now revealed as temporary luck rather than strategic genius. Professional military officers, who had subordinated their judgment to Hitler's intuition after France's conquest, recognized they were serving a leader whose decisions were increasingly disconnected from military reality. Most significantly, Stalingrad marked the irreversible shift of strategic initiative to the Soviet Union. German forces would launch one more major offensive, Operation Citadel at Kursk, in July 1943. But that offensive would fail, and afterward Germany would remain permanently on the defensive. The Red Army, having destroyed an entire German army at Stalingrad, understood it could defeat Wehrmacht forces through systematic application of superior resources. Soviet confidence soared, while German morale began its long decline toward ultimate collapse. The initiative lost forever Stalingrad was not the moment Germany lost World War II. That outcome had probably become inevitable when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, without resources to sustain a long war. But Stalingrad was the moment when Germany's defeat became undeniable to anyone willing to see it, the moment when operational competence could no longer compensate for strategic overextension, the moment when Hitler's strategic gamble revealed itself as catastrophic mistake that would consume Germany entirely. The strategy Hitler regretted most, if he was capable of regret, which remained uncertain, had now produced consequences that could not be reversed. An entire army destroyed, strategic initiative lost, German invincibility shattered, and the Red Army, bloodied but undefeated, preparing offensives that would drive westward inexorably toward Berlin. Hitler's obsession with capturing the city bearing Stalin's name had cost Germany an army it could not replace, casualties it could not sustain, and international reputation it could not restore. The war would continue for over 2 more years, consuming millions more lives, destroying additional armies, leaving Germany in ruins. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Stalingrad had decided the war. Everything after was merely determining how much destruction would occur before Germany accepted the defeat that Stalingrad had made inevitable. The breaking point had been reached. Germany would break. The underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery smelled of decay and defeat. Adolf Hitler, 56 but appearing decades older, hunched over maps that no longer represented reality, moving phantom divisions that had ceased to exist. His hands trembled. His eyes, once mesmerizing, had become watery and distant. Above him, Soviet artillery systematically reduced Berlin to rubble. The man who had remade Europe through will was now trapped underground, watching his Reich collapse. In rare moments between rage and delusion, Hitler acknowledged what he had denied for 4 years. Invading the Soviet Union had been the fatal mistake. Not a tactical error, but a strategic impossibility. An unwinnable war against an enemy whose resources Germany could never match. "If I had focused on Britain first," Hitler muttered during one conference, his voice barely audible, "if I had secured the Mediterranean, the resources. But I was impatient. I believed the Soviet Union would collapse. I believed ideology would overcome industrial reality. I was wrong." The death spiral. After Stalingrad, the Eastern Front became a meat grinder, consuming German strength faster than it could be replaced. The Red Army had evolved into a systematically competent machine, applying overwhelming material superiority. Soviet offensives followed brutal patterns: massive artillery bombardments, deep armored penetrations, methodical encirclements. German tactical skill remained superior, but meant nothing when enemies could afford 10-to-1 losses and still advance. Operation Citadel at Kursk in July 1943, Germany's last eastern offensive, epitomized the impossibility. Germany assembled its rebuilt panzer forces for a devastating blow. The offensive gained nothing and lost 1,500 tanks Germany couldn't replace. After Kursk, the Red Army never stopped advancing. By 1945, Germany had suffered over 4 million casualties in the Soviet Union. Entire generations destroyed. Equipment losses were catastrophic. 46,000 tanks produced, nearly all consumed in the east. The fuel crisis became terminal. Synthetic plants bombed. Romanian oil fields captured. Panzer divisions sat immobilized not from combat, but from empty fuel tanks. The West completes the trapped Normandy in June 1944, opened the second front German military tradition had warned against since Bismarck. Germany now fought the Soviet Union in the east, Britain and America in the west, the two-front war that made defeat inevitable. Allied material superiority was so complete that German daylight movement became impossible. Allied logistics sustained offensives German forces on starvation rations could not counter. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Hitler's last desperate gamble, demonstrated complete delusion. Germany squandered its final reserves on an offensive that accomplished nothing but proved Hitler's disconnection from reality. Allied strategic bombing completed Germany's destruction. Synthetic fuel plants demolished. Factories destroyed. Transportation networks wrecked. By early 1945, German industry had ceased functioning. The Wehrmacht fought with armies lacking fuel, air forces lacking aircraft, industries lacking materials. The final recognition. In the bunker during April 1945, Hitler oscillated between delusion and terrible clarity. "The generals were right," he told his secretary in late April. "They warned about two-front war, about Soviet distances, about industrial capacity. I overruled them because I believed Will could overcome material disadvantage. I was wrong, and Germany has paid the price. The admission was remarkable from a man whose career had been built on never acknowledging error. But even Hitler couldn't escape the evidence surrounding him. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces blocks away, Hitler committed suicide. Germany surrendered 8 days later. The Reich, promised to last 1,000 years, had survived 12. The fatal truth: Germany did not lose because of one battle. Stalingrad was catastrophic, but Germany fought on. Kursk was decisive, but resistance continued. Normandy opened the second front, but Wehrmacht soldiers still fought. Germany lost the war the moment Hitler ordered Operation Barbarossa to begin on June 22, 1941. That decision committed Germany to a war it lacked resources to win against an enemy whose capacity to absorb punishment exceeded anything German planning had considered. The Soviet Union's geography meant conquest couldn't eliminate its industry. Its population meant casualties barely dented reserves. Its relocated factories beyond the Urals meant production Germany could never stop. Every subsequent disaster flowed from that initial decision: the two-front war, the industrial imbalance, the grinding attrition. All became inevitable when German troops crossed into Soviet territory. In the bunker, Hitler finally acknowledged what generals had warned in 1941. Invading the Soviet Union was the fatal mistake from which no tactical brilliance could recover. The regret was real, but it changed nothing. Hitler had kicked in the door, believing the Soviet Union would collapse. Instead, what came through that door consumed Germany entirely. The strategy he regretted most had ensured Germany's defeat from the moment it began. And that regret, coming in a bunker with Soviet soldiers overhead, arrived far too late to matter.